The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered porch of the old farmhouse, where Samuel and Ruby Mae Washington sat in their rocking chairs, watching the empty dirt road that stretched toward town. At 78 and 76 respectively, their weathered hands told stories of decades spent working this land, their backs bent from years of labor, their hearts heavy with a burden that had grown heavier with each passing season. The farm that had once buzzed with the laughter of children and grandchildren now echoed only with the sound of wind through the cornstalks and the occasional creak of aging wood. Samuel adjusted his worn straw hat and glanced at Ruby Mae, whose silver hair caught the morning light like spun silk. They had been married for 54 years, and in all that time they had never imagined they would spend their golden years alone, forgotten by the very children they had sacrificed everything to raise. The irony wasn't lost on them that the soil beneath their feet, which had provided for their family for generations, now seemed to mock their solitude with its abundance. "You think any of them might call today?" Ruby Mae asked, her voice carrying that familiar note of hope that Samuel recognized but couldn't bear to crush, even though he knew better. Her fingers worked nervously at the edge of her faded apron, the same nervous habit she'd had since their first child was born. Samuel reached over and took her hand, his calloused palm rough against her soft skin. "Maybe, sweetheart, maybe today will be different." But even as he said the words, he knew they were both just going through the motions of hope, like actors in a play they'd performed too many times before. Their 3 children, Marcus, the eldest at 52, who had become a successful lawyer in Chicago, Diana, 48, who had married into wealth in Atlanta, and Jerome, the baby at 45, who had built a thriving construction business in Detroit, had all fled the rural Mississippi farm as soon as they were old enough. Promising to return, promising to take care of their parents, promising to never forget where they came from. But promises, Samuel had learned, were as fragile as morning dew. Marcus had been the first to go, earning a full scholarship to college on the back of his parents' unwavering support and sacrifice. Samuel remembered working double shifts at the lumber mill while Ruby Mae took in washing and ironing to pay for Marcus's books and school supplies. They had worn the same clothes for years, patched and repatched, so their son could have what he needed to succeed. When Marcus graduated law school, he had stood at the podium and thanked his parents, tears streaming down his face as he promised to make their sacrifices worthwhile. That was 15 years ago, and they could count on one hand the number of times he'd visited since. Diana had followed a different path, but with the same result. She had fallen in love with a wealthy businessman from Atlanta, and Ruby Mae had spent months hand-sewing her wedding dress, each stitch a prayer for her daughter's happiness. They had mortgaged part of the farm to pay for the wedding, wanting Diana to have the celebration she deserved. Diana had promised that once she was settled, she would bring her parents to live with her in her big house, where they could be comfortable and cared for. But after the wedding, the calls became fewer. The visits stopped entirely, and when Ruby Mae had a mild heart attack 3 years ago, Diana had sent flowers instead of coming herself. Jerome, their baby, had broken their hearts the most completely because he had been the one who seemed to understand the value of family. He had worked the farm alongside his father through high school, learning the land and the crops, talking about modernizing the operation and making it profitable again. But when he turned 18, the allure of the city proved too strong, and he left to learn construction, promising to come back and build them a new house. His business had flourished, and Samuel would occasionally see articles about Jerome's company in the regional business magazines, but the new house never materialized, and neither did Jerome. The abandonment hadn't happened overnight. It had been a slow, painful process, like watching a favorite tree die branch by branch. First, the weekly phone calls became monthly. Then the monthly calls became holiday calls. Then even the holidays began to pass in silence. When Samuel had his stroke 2 years ago, leaving his left side weak and his speech slightly slurred, none of the children had come to help. Ruby May had nursed him back to health alone, and when she had called Marcus, Diana, and Jerome to tell them their father was in the hospital, she had gotten voicemails, secretaries, and eventually text messages expressing concern but offering no actual help. The farm itself was becoming too much for them to handle. What had once been a thriving operation with crops and livestock had slowly diminished to a few chickens, a vegetable garden, and fields that were increasingly left fallow. Samuel's stroke had robbed him of much of his strength, and Ruby May, despite her determination, was no match for the physical demands of farming. They had discussed selling the land and moving to town, but this farm was their legacy, the foundation upon which they had built their family, and the thought of letting it go felt like surrendering everything they had worked for. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest part of their situation. Their old friends had either passed away or moved to be closer to their own families, and the younger generation in their small community was busy with their own lives. Samuel and Ruby May found themselves increasingly dependent on the kindness of neighbors for rides to doctor's appointments and grocery shopping, a dependence that made them feel like burdens rather than the respected elders they had once been. "Remember when this place was full of grandchildren running around?" Ruby May said, her voice barely above a whisper as she watched a butterfly land on the porch railing. Marcus's 2 boys used to love feeding the chickens, and Diana's little girl would spend hours picking flowers in the garden. Samuel nodded, remembering those precious summers when their children would visit with their families, when the farmhouse would ring with laughter and the dinner table would be crowded with loved ones. Now, even their grandchildren were strangers to them, growing up in distant cities, knowing their paternal and maternal grandparents only through photographs and the increasingly rare video calls that their parents orchestrated out of guilt rather than genuine desire to connect. The mailman, Jerry Peterson, pulled up in his truck, interrupting their quiet reminiscence. Jerry was one of the few people who still treated Samuel and Ruby May with the respect and warmth they deserved, always taking time to chat and check on their well-being. "Morning, Mr. and Mrs. Washington," Jerry called out as he approached the porch, a thick envelope in his hand. "Got something official looking for you today. Looks like it's from some law firm up in Jackson." Samuel's heart skipped a beat as he took the envelope, his hands trembling slightly as he read the return address. Henderson, Mills and Associates, Attorneys at Law. The envelope was thick and formal, the kind that usually brought bad news or legal complications they couldn't afford to deal with. "Thank you, Jerry," Ruby May said, though her voice carried a note of apprehension. "Everything all right with you and Patricia?" "Oh, we're doing fine, Mrs. Washington. Patricia keeps asking when you're going to bring by more of those peach preserves. She says they're the best she's ever tasted." Jerry tipped his hat and headed back to his truck, leaving the elderly couple alone with the mysterious envelope. Samuel's hands shook as he opened the envelope, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. As he read the letter, his expression changed from apprehension to confusion to absolute shock. Ruby May watched his face, her own heart pounding as she waited for him to explain what the letter contained. "Ruby May," Samuel said, his voice barely audible, "you need to hear this." He cleared his throat and began to read aloud. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Washington, we are writing to inform you that our client, Mrs. Wilhelmina Henderson, recently passed away and has named you as beneficiaries in her will. Mrs. Henderson was your great-aunt, the sister of your grandfather, Thomas Washington. According to our records and the documentation she provided, Mrs. Henderson had no direct descendants and chose to leave her considerable estate to her only living relatives." Ruby May gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Aunt Wilhelmina. But Samuel, I thought she died years ago." Didn't your father say she moved up north during the Depression and they lost touch? Samuel continued reading, his voice growing stronger with each word. Mrs. Henderson accumulated significant wealth through real estate investments and business ventures over her lifetime. Her estate includes properties in Jackson, Mississippi, Memphis, Tennessee, and Chicago, Illinois, as well as substantial financial assets. The total value of the estate is approximately $12 million. The letter fell from Samuel's hands as if it had suddenly become too heavy to hold. Ruby May stared at him, her mouth open, unable to process what she had just heard. $12 million. They had spent their entire lives struggling to make ends meet, worrying about medical bills and farm expenses, and now they were being told they had inherited more money than they could have imagined in their wildest dreams. "Samuel," Ruby May whispered, "are you sure you read that right? 12 million. Samuel picked up the letter with shaking hands and read it again, more slowly this time. The words were the same, but the reality of what they meant was still sinking in. They were no longer the abandoned, struggling, elderly couple they had been that morning. They were suddenly wealthy beyond their wildest dreams, and the implications of this change were staggering. The letter went on to explain that Mrs. Henderson had been following their family from afar, had known about their children's success and their subsequent abandonment of their parents. She had specifically instructed in her will that the inheritance should go to Samuel and Ruby May, with detailed instructions about how the estate should be handled and distributed. "There's more," Samuel said, his voice still shaky. "It says here that Mrs. Henderson left specific instructions. She wanted us to know that she had been aware of our situation for some time and that she admired our dignity in the face of abandonment. She also left instructions that if we choose to share our inheritance with our children, we should do so only if they demonstrate genuine remorse and commitment to being part of our lives going forward." Ruby May stood up slowly, her legs unsteady, and walked to the edge of the porch. She looked out over the fields that had defined their lives, the same fields that their children had been so eager to escape, and felt a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite sort through. Relief, certainly, that their financial worries were over. Vindication, perhaps, that their years of hard work and sacrifice had somehow been recognized and rewarded. But also a deep sadness that it had taken a stranger's generosity to change their circumstances, rather than the love and support of their own children. "What do we do now, Samuel?" she asked, turning back to face her husband, who was still staring at the letter as if it might disappear if he looked away. "I suppose we call this lawyer and find out exactly what this means," Samuel replied, though his mind was already racing ahead to the broader implications. "But Ruby May, I think we need to be very careful about how we handle this. Our children, they're going to find out eventually, and when they do." Ruby May nodded, understanding exactly what her husband was implying. Their children, who had been too busy with their successful lives to visit or call, would suddenly be very interested in renewing their relationship with their parents. The question was whether that renewed interest would be genuine or purely motivated by the prospect of inheritance. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls with lawyers, meetings with financial advisors, and the gradual realization that their lives had fundamentally changed overnight. The lawyers confirmed that the inheritance was legitimate and substantial, and they began the process of transferring the assets to Samuel and Ruby May's names. The elderly couple found themselves thrust into a world of investment portfolios, real estate holdings, and financial decisions they had never imagined having to make. Word of their inheritance spread through their small community with the speed of wildfire. Neighbors who had occasionally checked on them suddenly became frequent visitors, bringing casseroles and offers to help with anything they might need. The local bank president, who had never given them more than a polite nod, suddenly appeared at their door with information about investment opportunities and private banking services. But it was the response from their children that Samuel and Ruby May were most interested in and most apprehensive about. They had decided not to tell Marcus, Diana, and Jerome about the inheritance directly, wanting to see how long it would take for the news to reach them through other channels, and more importantly, how they would respond. It took exactly 1 week. Marcus was the first to call, his voice carrying a warmth and concern that had been absent for years. "Dad, Mom, I just heard from someone at the office who has connections in Mississippi that you all might have come into some money. I wanted to call and make sure you're okay, make sure no one is trying to take advantage of you." Samuel held the phone away from his ear so Ruby May could hear, and they exchanged knowing glances. "We're fine, Marcus," Samuel replied, his voice neutral. "Why the sudden interest in our well-being?" "Dad, I know I haven't been the best son lately. I've been so caught up in work and my own problems that I haven't been there for you and Mom the way I should have been. But I want to change that. I want to come home and visit, maybe help you figure out how to handle this new situation." Diana called later that same day, her voice tearful and full of apologies. "Mama, Daddy, I'm so sorry I haven't been there for you. When I heard about your good fortune, it made me realize how much I've failed you as a daughter. I want to come home and spend time with you, help you enjoy this blessing." Jerome's call came that evening, and his approach was more direct. "Dad, I heard through the construction network that you all inherited some serious money. I'm worried about you and Mom handling all this alone. I think I should come down and help you make some decisions, maybe invest in some property or business ventures that could benefit the whole family." Samuel and Ruby May listened to their children's sudden outpouring of concern and love with a mixture of heartbreak and anger. These were the same children who had been too busy to visit when Samuel had his stroke, too occupied with their own lives to call when Ruby May had her heart attack, too successful to remember where they came from or who had sacrificed to make their success possible. "What do you think we should do?" Ruby May asked after Jerome's call ended. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the farm that had defined their lives for so many decades. "I think," he said finally, "that we should let them come, all 3 of them. Let them show us who they really are, and then we'll decide what kind of relationship we want to have going forward." Ruby May nodded, understanding that this inheritance had given them something more valuable than money. It had given them power. For the first time in years, they were in control of the relationship with their children, and they intended to use that power wisely. They called each of their children back and invited them to come home for a family reunion, the first one in over a decade. They didn't discuss the inheritance directly, but they made it clear that they had some important family matters to discuss and decisions to make about their future. Marcus arrived first, pulling up in his expensive BMW, wearing a tailored suit that probably cost more than Samuel and Ruby May's monthly income. He embraced his parents with an enthusiasm that felt forced and spent the first hour cataloguing everything that needed to be fixed or updated around the farm, as if he were already planning how to spend their money. Diana arrived the next day with her husband Charles, driving a Mercedes SUV and carrying expensive luggage. She immediately began taking pictures of the farmhouse and surrounding property, commenting on how charming it was, and how it could be turned into a beautiful vacation retreat with the right investments. Jerome was the last to arrive, and his approach was the most transparent. He brought architectural drawings and construction estimates, prepared to show his parents how their inheritance could be used to modernize the farm, build new structures, and create a family compound where everyone could benefit from the wealth. The first family dinner in years was a surreal experience. The dining room table that had sat largely empty for so long was suddenly crowded with Samuel and Ruby May's children and their spouses, everyone talking loudly and enthusiastically about plans for the future. But Samuel and Ruby May noticed that none of their children asked about their health, their loneliness, or their struggles over the past years. The conversation centered entirely around the inheritance and how it should be managed. "Dad, I really think you should let me handle the financial planning," Marcus said, cutting into his second helping of Ruby May's fried chicken. "I have connections with investment firms that could double this money in a few years. Of course, I'd want to make sure you and Mom are comfortable first, but we need to think about the family legacy here." "Marcus is right about planning," Diana chimed in, "but I think we should also consider purchasing property in more desirable locations. Charles and I know some excellent real estate opportunities in Atlanta that would be perfect for family investments." Jerome set down his fork and looked directly at his parents. "Look, I'm just going to be honest here. This money is a blessing, but it's also a responsibility. You two can't manage $12 million alone at your age. You need family support, and we're here to provide it. I think we should set up a family trust with all of us as trustees." Samuel had been listening to his children's plans and proposals with growing sadness and anger. These were the same children who had claimed they were too busy to visit, too overwhelmed with their own lives to maintain regular contact, too successful to remember their humble origins. Now they were sitting at his table, eating his wife's cooking and discussing his money as if it were already theirs to distribute. "That's enough," Samuel said quietly, but with enough authority to silence the table. "I think it's time we had a real conversation about why you're all here." The room fell silent, and Samuel could see the discomfort on his children's faces as they realized their father might not be as easily manipulated as they had assumed. "For the past several years," Samuel continued, his voice growing stronger, "your mother and I have lived on this farm alone, forgotten by the children we raised and sacrificed everything for. When I had my stroke, none of you came. When your mother had her heart attack, none of you visited. When we needed help with the farm, with doctor's appointments, with the simple human need for companionship, you were all too busy with your successful lives to be bothered." Ruby May reached over and took her husband's hand, giving him strength to continue. "Now suddenly, after we inherited money, you're all here, full of love and concern, and plans for our future. Do you think we don't see what this is really about?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Dad, that's not fair. We all have responsibilities, families of our own to take care of. It's not that we didn't care, we just assumed you two were doing fine on your own." "Assumed?" Ruby May's voice was sharp with anger. "You assumed we were fine when your father couldn't work for 6 months after his stroke. You assumed we were fine when I was in the hospital and called each of you for help. You assumed we were fine when we haven't seen our grandchildren in 3 years. Diana began to cry, though Samuel and Ruby May couldn't tell if the tears were genuine or calculated. "Mama, I know we made mistakes, but we're here now. We want to make it right." "Do you?" Samuel asked. "Or do you want to make sure you get your share of the inheritance?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Samuel could see his children's true motivations written clearly on their faces. Jerome was the first to recover, his business mind quickly calculating a new approach. "Dad, of course we want to be part of your life. The money doesn't matter. We just want our family to be together again." But even as he said the words, Samuel could see Jerome glancing around the farmhouse, mentally cataloguing its value and potential. Samuel stood up slowly, his stroke-weakened left side making the movement deliberate and careful. "Your great-aunt Wilhelmina, who you never knew existed, left us very specific instructions along with this inheritance. She wanted us to be sure that if we chose to share this blessing with our children, it should only be with those who demonstrate genuine love and commitment to being part of our lives." He walked to the old oak cabinet where Ruby May kept her important papers and pulled out a folder that contained not just Aunt Wilhelmina's will, but also documentation of every unanswered phone call, every missed holiday, every time their children had been too busy for their parents over the past decade. "Your great-aunt Wilhelmina may not have known you personally," Samuel continued, "but she was wise enough to understand that money can reveal people's true character. She was also wise enough to understand that parents who have been abandoned by their children need protection, even from those children." Ruby May stood and joined her husband, her voice steady and clear. "We've made our decision about the inheritance and about our relationship with each of you going forward." Marcus, Diana, and Jerome looked at each other with growing alarm as they realized that their parents were not going to be the easy targets they had assumed. "We've decided," Samuel announced, "that we're going to use this money to live the life we deserve in our remaining years. We're going to travel, see the world we never got to see while we were working to support your dreams. We're going to renovate this farmhouse and make it beautiful again. We're going to establish a scholarship fund for local students who need help getting an education, the way we helped all of you. And as for sharing this inheritance with our children," Ruby May added, "we've decided that anyone who wants to be part of our family going forward needs to prove that their interest is in us, not our money. That means regular visits, not just when it's convenient. That means being present for birthdays and holidays and medical appointments. That means treating us like the parents who loved and supported you, not like ATM machines to fund your own ambitions." The room erupted in protests and arguments. Marcus accused his parents of being unfair and unreasonable. Diana cried that she had always loved them and that money was making them suspicious and cruel. Jerome argued that they were being manipulated by lawyers and didn't understand the responsibilities that came with wealth. But Samuel and Ruby May had found their strength again, and they refused to be swayed by their children's emotional manipulation or logical arguments. "The inheritance is ours to do with as we choose," Samuel said firmly, "and we choose to spend our remaining years surrounded by people who love us for who we are, not what we have. If any of you can prove over time that your interest in us is genuine, then we'll reconsider including you in our legacy. But that proof will take years, not days or weeks." One by one, their children realized that their quick schemes to access their parents' inheritance had failed. Marcus was the first to leave, angrily declaring that his parents had become bitter and greedy. Diana left in tears, claiming that money had changed her parents and destroyed their family. Jerome was the last to go, still trying to convince his parents that they needed his business expertise, but eventually admitting defeat when he realized they were not going to be swayed. After their children left, Samuel and Ruby May sat on their porch again, watching the sun set over the fields that had been their life's work. The silence that had once felt lonely now felt peaceful. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Ruby May asked, though she already knew the answer in her heart. Samuel reached over and took her hand, the same gesture of comfort and support that had sustained them through 54 years of marriage. "I think," he said, "that we finally stood up for ourselves and demanded the respect we deserve. Whether our children learn to love us for who we are instead of what we have is up to them now." In the months that followed, Samuel and Ruby May used their inheritance to transform their lives in ways they had never imagined possible. They hired help for the farm, allowing Samuel to continue working the land he loved without the physical strain that had been breaking his body. They renovated the farmhouse, turning it into the beautiful home Ruby May had always dreamed of, with modern conveniences, but preserving the character and history that made it special. They traveled for the first time in their lives, visiting places they had only seen in magazines. Paris, where they walked along the Seine and ate in sidewalk cafes. Hawaii, where they watched sunsets over the ocean and felt sand between their toes. New York City, where they saw Broadway shows and visited museums. Each trip was a revelation, showing them a world beyond the boundaries of their farm and their small community. Most importantly, they established the Washington Family Education Foundation, providing scholarships for deserving students from their community who needed help achieving their educational dreams. The foundation became their greatest source of pride, allowing them to give other families the opportunities they had worked so hard to provide for their own children. Their relationship with Marcus, Diana, and Jerome evolved slowly and painfully. Marcus made a few attempts to re-establish contact, but his efforts were clearly motivated by financial interest rather than genuine affection, and eventually he stopped trying. Diana made more consistent efforts, visiting a few times and calling occasionally, but her interactions with her parents remained surface-level and transactional, focused more on maintaining access to potential inheritance than on building real relationships. Jerome surprised them by being the one who seemed to understand what he had lost. 6 months after the confrontation, he began visiting regularly, not to discuss money or business opportunities, but simply to spend time with his parents. He helped with farm work, listened to their stories about their travels, and gradually began to rebuild the relationship he had abandoned years earlier. It took 2 years of consistent effort and genuine change before Samuel and Ruby May felt confident that Jerome's renewed interest in their lives was authentic. On their 56th wedding anniversary, Samuel and Ruby May sat on their renovated porch, looking out over fields that were once again productive and beautiful. Jerome was visiting with his own family, and for the first time in years, grandchildren's laughter echoed across the farm. Marcus and Diana had not been invited to the anniversary celebration, a painful but necessary decision that reflected the reality of their choices. "Do you ever regret how we handled the inheritance situation?" Ruby May asked, watching her youngest grandchild chase chickens in the yard. Samuel smiled, his stroke-affected speech clearer now after months of therapy that the inheritance had made possible. "The only thing I regret," he said, "is that it took inheriting money for us to realize we deserved better treatment from our own children. But I'm grateful that it happened while we were still young enough to enjoy the life we built together and wise enough to know the difference between people who love us and people who love what we have." And the Washington family story became something of a legend in their small Mississippi community, a cautionary tale about the importance of treating elderly parents with respect and love, regardless of their financial circumstances. Samuel and Ruby May's transformation from forgotten, abandoned elderly people to empowered, respected community leaders inspired other families to examine their own relationships and priorities. Their inheritance had given them more than financial security. It had given them dignity, choice, and the power to demand the love and respect they had always deserved. Most importantly, it had taught them that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, never too late to demand better treatment from those who claim to love you, and never too late to create the life you truly deserve. As the sun set on another day at the Washington farm, Samuel and Ruby May rocked gently in their chairs, surrounded by the beauty they had created and the peace they had earned. Their story was a reminder that true wealth isn't measured only in money, but in dignity, respect, and the courage to demand both from those who claim to love you. Sometimes it takes a shock to reveal people's true character, but when it does, the truth can set you free to live the life you've always deserved.